Hi, Andrés.
Hello, Bob.
How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. Let me introduce us. You are Andrés Miguel Rondon,
Yeah,
and I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are an economist living in Madrid, but more relevant to what we're going to talk about is the fact that you did live in Venezuela for a long time.
for
Uh,
my life, in fact.
yeah, and in particular during the rule of Hugo Chavez.
Yeah,
And you wrote a piece in the Washington Post called "In Venezuela, We Couldn't Stop Chavez. Don't Make the Mistakes We Did." And there was a comparison there between Chavez and Donald Trump.
yeah,
And it was a very interesting piece, but partly because it kind of confirmed some concerns I had
yeah,
about how overreaction to Trumpism may actually play into his hands.
yeah.
And you've lived through something that you think is kind of like this, and have some lessons for us, I think. Why don't we start by reminding people a little bit about Chavez in Venezuela? There are a lot of differences, and we should highlight those as well as the commonalities. I mean, for starters, he initially tried to take power in a military coup, right? He was a military guy,
Yeah,
but in
yeah,
the end, he did the way he actually succeeded was getting elected, right?
absolutely, yeah. By an overwhelming margin as well.
Okay.
And he was democratically elected all throughout. So I'm not ready to define him as a dictator, just who starts it.
You don't want to call him a dictator,
No, I don't,
right?
because I mean, what he left in place was uh, dictatorial, the system he left in place, and then now with Maduro, it definitely is. I mean, that's not something I would be very uncomfortable with saying.
That's his successor, Nicolas
Yeah,
Maduro.
that is. Yeah, that's his current, the current president of Venezuela, and that is definitely a dictatorship, by all means. But he was continually elected, and so he was a phenomenon of democracy, not of autocracy in that sense, in the strict sense of the word. So yes, so he tried first to make a coup in 1992, and that failed. But he became a media phenomenon.
Was he put in jail after the coup failed?
He was, but curiously enough, he was given 30 seconds of airtime during the coup, just to tell his comrades to stop fighting. And as he did so, he said, "We've failed to achieve our current goals for now," and that "for now" became famous. So we are going to live in this current system for now, and that became a phenomenon. So he was a media phenomenon when it went viral, and that's what made him able to be a recognizable character once he ran for power, and which he got rather easily in the election, and then from then on, it's a completely different story. But that's sort of his origin and his path to power sort of thing.
Okay, so then when he does get elected, and when was that? That was 1998.
Yeah,
This is where you start drawing some parallels with Donald Trump. They're different in a lot of ways. Ideologically, Chavez is an out-and-out socialist. Trump isn't, and so on. But you say they are both masters of populism.
yeah, and in that sense, ideology really does take a back seat. I don't think either Trump or Chavez were sincere, ideologues of whatever they were espousing. They were first and foremost populists, and that really takes them in a completely different path. One in which they are incredibly similar. So, curiously enough, so Chavez was, factually, or an ideologue socialist who anti-imperialist as well. So I've been living in Europe for a while, and I've met more than one Chavez supporter, say from Paris. Sort of like the in vogue socialist who thinks, oh, he's anti-imperial, therefore he's like a Che Guevara kind of figure, and to many that he was, including to his own supporters in Venezuela. But in reality, he kept selling oil to the United States, for all commercial and political purposes. He did not break in any true sense his relationship with the United States, and you can call him a hypocrite, which he definitely was in that regard. But the point I'm making is that both him and Donald Trump are judged more by the way people, see him in this other, paradigm where he is suddenly a savior of, or the defender of, Latin American, protest against, North American imperialism and socialism, similar to the Cuban or the Soviet model, in the more sort of idealistic, iterations of such.
And we should say that, speaking of hypocrisy, Trump himself has been accused of hypocrisy because, the Trump products are made with cheap foreign labor and so on, even though he rails against trade with countries that have cheap labor and so on. But that doesn't particularly matter. The hypocrisy is not a big obstacle for either of them.
No,
and that's because there's like a power in the story they're telling, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the point I'm trying to make. There's many traps that one can, rational arguments that one can make to convince oneself that Trump won out of sheer stupidity, out of sheer irrationality. But I think that's very indolent intellectually. So it's very easy to say things like, people voted for Trump because they were racist all the same, and even though they realize that he's an hypocrite, they don't really care about what he says or plans, because at the end of the day, you want someone like him in power anyway. Sort of thing. It's sort of the argument that they voted for him because he was an hypocrite. But the point I'm trying to make is that no, they voted for him despite that many people said he was an hypocrite. They didn't believe that he was an hypocrite. I think many people who believe in Trump believe in what he says.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with the source of his appeal and the source of Chavez's appeal and what they have in common. In both cases, according to your Washington Post piece, there is a grievance. There are people feel they have been wronged, right? They both start with that. And what is the difference and what are the commonalities for starters? I mean, in Venezuela, and I think we should be attentive throughout to the actual differences that may be consequential. In Venezuela, there was a much, well, you tell me, you're the economist, but my assumption is that there was more in the way of income inequality or more in the way of poverty than in the United States. Is that right or wrong?
It's half right, actually. So it was, it was a much definitely poorer country in terms of GDP per capita, say. But it was an equally unequal country. Actually, if you look at the Gini coefficient in the United States and Venezuela, they're very similar.
Yeah. The Gini coefficient being a measurement of inequality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so absolute income levels were lower on balance, but inequality maybe was common.
And that's one of the biggest similarities between the two. The fact that they both occur in a time of grievance. And at a time of grievance, described to a large extent by this lack of social mobility and wealth inequality.
They feel they're not going. They have no hope of joining what they perceive to be the privileged class.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then what is the story? What's common to the story? And there are other differences too. I mean, Venezuela, the economies are very different. Venezuela is a big oil state. Yeah. Much more dependent on a single resource than the United States. So there are all kinds of differences, but what is the similarity between the way Trump and Chavez politically exploit that sense of grievance?
I think it works in a, for an economist, it's kind of curious of me to say, but I think the appeal they have has not that much to do with the general economy or, say, the wealth of the country in more blunt terms, but more to do with how they deal with your grievance. They go straight to the root, in a sense, right?
What do you mean by that?
Okay, so you're grieving, yeah, in a very sort of innocent and naive way of putting it, in a sort of social liberal point of view, that grievance could be abated by you, suddenly, getting a better education, better healthcare, better material, a certain sense of material progress in your life, yeah, as well with relation to your, civil liberties and so on and so forth, and that will make you a happier person, sort of thing, in a purely utilitarian point of view. What I'm trying to get at is that there is an alternative which can sort of cut to the chase. So there has to be no material progress for you to feel less aggrieved. And this is a very
you mean so there's a way for him to address the grievance without increasing material prosperity is the point?
Absolutely, and more to the point, with actually destroying the material wealth. So this is a very curious thing. I mean, one of the greatest and most wondrous social phenomena I've witnessed in my life as a Venezuelan is to see nowadays, people from very poor background who are even worse off now than they were, before Chavez came to power, still thinking that he was a positive influence to the country, even though, by all statistic means, he was an absolute catastrophe to the country. We're talking about a person who left the country in ruins after presiding through the biggest oil boom in history.
So you're saying Trump does not have to actually make the lives of these people better in order to thrive politically and retain their support?
Absolutely, and I think that he manages to soothe or comfort this grievance immediately just by his message, because it operates through a very different channel than the one we're used to.
And what is the message and what is the power of the message? I mean, what is the part of the message that is common to him and, Chavez? Just generically, what are they doing psychologically?
Okay, so what they say is that you're suffering because of them. And not them.
Them not being Trump or Chavez, but them being another group.
Yeah.
Like you in Venezuela or me in the United States.
Some scapegoat. Yeah.
Right.
Once that gains a certain following, that can be so powerful. Because, for example, if you are poor in a socially mobile country, and this is something that Tocqueville found out, a long time ago, and he says it in Democracy in America. It's a great reflection. He says that if you are poor in a socially mobile country, you have no one to blame but yourself. So why am I suffering? Because I failed, right? So at some point or other in society, many people have to explain to themselves, why are they suffering? And one easy and convincing enough explanation, if many people are following it, is that I am suffering because of X person. I want to say fuck me over, but yeah, and so on. And that can be that can be so soothing. From then on, you don't longer blame yourself.
So who was blamed in Venezuela for the suffering of the common people?
The political system. So the traditional political parties, the traditional economic interest groups and
well, were you among the blamed? I mean, did you belong to the demographic class that was blamed?
I was.
By virtue of what?
Okay.
Because you were from a relatively prosperous,
Yes,
upper middle class family or something?
Yeah, I was. But in an effort to full disclosure, I was born in 1991, so I was only 7 years old when Chavez, won the election.
Okay.
So, I don't know how much a 7-year-old can really, do in terms of setting up an oligarchy, but, I was...
You were much closer to adulthood by the end of his... when did he die? He died in 2000. So you were an adult by the time he died, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But, I left when, I'm 25 now. I left Venezuela when I was 17.
Okay.
By then, I still was blamed. I was blamed all throughout my life. In a curious way. It's as if there was a cartoon of me.
And the cartoon was what? What cartoon did Chavez...
The cartoon was that I was an not me generally, but of the cartoonish enemy that Trump wanted to, that Chavez put forth, of which I was unavoidably part, was that, they were people who were very insensitive to, poverty in Venezuela, that they had a fondness for the United States in general and to Miami in particular, for example, that they wanted to exploit, the working class, and not only that they were part of the reason why that there was so much poverty. Not only that they were insensitive to it, but that they were culprits of it. So that they wanted to exploit it, and so on and so forth.
So the story Trump is telling it sounds pretty similar. He says that the elites are, first of all, they do have a kind of a foreign allegiance. You said that was part of the allegation of Chavez, that Venezuelans had an allegiance to the United States. Here, Trump's story is that we have an allegiance to elites in other countries that is greater than our allegiance to America. So we want to trade with them and make, and we get rich, they get rich, Americans suffer. And then there is also, the other big thing is these big banks, big, business, Wall Street and so on. I don't know whether...
Yeah, Robert, but I wouldn't focus so much on this story, because there is an endless possibility of stories. There's an endless possibility of enemies, and an endless possibility of you explaining your own grievances. The plot is always the same.
Right, but there is this idea that we don't... It seems an essential plot ingredient is we do not care about the common people in our own country. We care about others more, whether it's rich people in our country or people in other countries, right? That is essential to the narrative.
Yeah, that is a common element, but I don't think that is the main reason why people follow this narrative. So what I'm trying to argue is that the narrative itself is less sort of like the supply side of the equation. So the way that it's presented to you does not matter as much as your own desire to seek an answer, your own desire to feel less aggrieved by any means possible. So I think one of the main issues I've been seeing, I read a lot of opinion pieces in journalism, every day, and a lot of the things I disagree with the most are related to how Trump supporters are, portrayed as victims in this whole mess. So sort of as they were manipulated by the likes of Cambridge Analytica, say. So now there's new data polling methods, and suddenly, they, social media and Facebook, if only, they weren't so manipulated, as if it was all supply side, as if it was all part of a mechanism that sort of herded them into Trump. But I disagree with that. I think there's a big component, and maybe the main component is their own desire to seek an explanation and to look for it by any means possible.
But the explanation involves people to blame.
Yeah,
right. I mean, if it didn't involve people to blame, it would be an unsatisfactory explanation.
Absolutely, I think that's an integral part of the plot. So you do need to blame someone at some point.
And we, people like me are kind of blamed in the United States. People like you were kind of blamed in Venezuela. Yeah. Now, what is the big mistake that you think Venezuelans made? Opponents of Chavez made in Venezuela.
One is that they actually became the cartoon to a large extent.
Mm-hmm.
There was American intervention, in the failed coup d'état in 2002.
Right, right. There was an anti-Chavez coup attempted, and the Bush administration kind of signaled initially that it would be fine with that. Yeah. I don't actually know if we were involved in or even aware of the planning, but clearly it would have been okay with us if democracy had been subverted in Venezuela.
So yeah, I mean, if we want to be absolutely certain, then yes, there was a certain acceptance of whatever regime would follow. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of intervention either. I mean, but anyways, that's
we identified ourselves with the coup plotters. The Bush administration's initial reaction did do that, right? Okay.
So we did become the cartoon to some extent, but
in the sense that they were saying you were anti-democratic, and by supporting the coup, you proved that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean that was. And that's just one item in the list. We also made we also made a general strike that lasted for like 4 months and brought down our GDP by 14% in the first semester of 2003. I mean, we did a bunch of other stuff as well. We withdrew from the parliamentary elections, and the list goes on. So
you kind of almost boycotted the democratic and economic process to some extent, which is more extreme than anything that has happened here so far, right?
No, and I doubt it would happen. I mean, I think the main difference between what happened in Venezuela, almost 20 years ago, and what's happening now in the U.S. is that you have a better opposition, or one would hope you do. And that is reflected in these cases in particular. I don't think you guys would try to coup d'etat or anything of the sort. But I think we're facing this a very similar monster. Just have better weapons.
But what kinds of things do you see us either doing that are a mistake, or things that we seem tempted or inclined to do that are kind of a strategic mistake?
Okay, so that one was the most blatant one, but there are other ones where I do see things happening, and I would advise against them. So a big part of these sort of narratives can only function if you have someone to blame, and if you're able to cartoon them, and you're able to instill that in people's, imaginarium, right? And that relies on polarization, on, there being two sides. You're either with me or against me.
So polarization is an asset for Trump.
It is definitely an asset, and it's also a trap, and I think that many people are falling into it. And the main way, the main example of such is by, when I hear people saying that, the United States is divided into two sides, liberals and racists, for example.
So you mean when opponents of Trump call the opposition racist, that is deepening the polarization and so helping Trump?
Yeah. No, I mean, the whole basket of deplorables comments, for example.
Yeah, the deplorables. Yeah, this was not one of the most astute political utterances in our.
Yeah, I think it was absolutely ridiculous, but horrendous. But in any case, that idea that we are good guys and they are the deplorables, or half of them are the deplorables.
And you emphasize in this Washington Post piece, don't show contempt for the opposition. But part of the challenge is that Trump himself, and I don't even believe that the average Trump supporter deserves contempt. I mean, several of them are closely related to me, and moreover, I just feel that the way human beings are, at least the Americans that I've encountered, by and large, they don't want to think of themselves as racist. They don't say overtly racist things. All of us have probably prejudice in one sense or another, but I don't think these are horrible people. So I actually don't feel contempt for the supporters, but I do feel contempt for Trump, and I'm convinced he deserves it. And I think part of the challenge, when I look at the way I behave on Twitter, for example, is I know I do come off as like snarky, as disdainful of Trump, as contemptuous of Trump. Yeah. Are you saying that itself is bad? That when we just treat the man himself that way, without casting these kinds of aspersions on his supporters, is that itself playing into his hands?
Okay, so that's a good point. I think the one thing you shouldn't do is have contempt for the supporters directly. I think we both agree there. The other thing is that I understand your contempt for Trump. I share it, as I did with Chavez. But at the same time, I am also aware of the fact that if you do show contempt for him, you are less likely to be able to convince Trump supporters. Yeah.
So you think I should restrain myself on? I should adopt it's hard, because you get a lot of positive reinforcement for being snarky about Trump, and you get more followers.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's a very difficult question, Robert, and I would be lying to you if I knew the correct answer to it. Mm-hmm. Not only in a real politic point of view, but in a moral sense of view. I don't know what the right answer to that is. And I know I presented my article as some sort of guide, but I'm much more comfortable criticizing than I am giving solutions, and this is something I need to be absolutely transparent about. What I do think is that once you are aware of the criticisms, and once you are aware that there's something much more profound at play here, you might address the question differently. And address Trump supporters in particular differently. I think there can be a combination of you having contempt for Trump and compassion for Trump supporters at the same time, and that might be ideal. But the gist of the matter is that Trump supporters, despite his hypocrisy, despite his racism, and all the xenophobia and so on, do find solace in him, and that is worthy of respect. And this is something I would like to point out. This is something that I'm going to mention in following articles, but there is a great similarity between religion and populism, and the same respect one owes to someone who finds meaning in life through religion, and who, at the end of the day, is a good neighbor and a good co-worker or a good cousin, or whatever, is very similar to that respect that you owe to someone who finds meaning through populism. Because I think at the end of the day, when I mean that they cut to the chase, is that they actually give meaning to very important questions in in society that many of these people struggle with. So why am I suffering? I'm suffering because of them. What are we going to do? We're going to follow him. And in that sense, I think that there's something that many people are not ready to recognize. And once you do, I think you look at things differently.
Okay. And I know you bring this up in, I think, a piece you're writing for Politico that hasn't been published yet, right? But you and maybe there and maybe another place, you're going to get into this this issue of what is being called kind of a post-truth environment or a post-factual environment. And again, this comes largely from people who are Trump critics who are dismayed that so much seeming falsehood flourishes, and that Trump says things that are just manifestly false or at best completely undocumented, uncorroborated, and he doesn't seem to suffer as much as you might expect for doing that repeatedly. But you have a particular take on like whether it makes sense to think of this as a post-truth environment and what the actual roots of it are, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, the issue with my take is that I go into murky grounds, right? Because I try to get to the roots of the matter, and that's a very deep and ambiguous one. But it all is inspired by this phenomenon I told you about earlier, which I think is the greatest social phenomenon I've witnessed in my life, which is to see Chavez supporters being worse off than he was before he came to power, and still think that he was a positive influence to the country. So in a purely material sense, they are worse off. And so if, politics and, political parties or political ideologies are all about progress, then they shouldn't have worked for these people, but they did. And they did because actual progress or factual progress matters less than what populism can give, even though it's false. There's a sense of a placebo effect if we were to be purely scientific about it.
And that consists in just basically having someone to blame? Is that the key?
Yeah. It's having someone to blame and something and a certain program of what you're going to do. I don't want to be very dogmatic about it, but there are different parts to it, of which having someone to blame is just the first.
And having a plan is, at least professing to have a plan that's going to solve things is important too, I gather, although you think that in the end it's not critical that the plan actually work.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, didn't Chavez have a day of reckoning? I mean, 8-10 years into his tenure, if things were not getting materially better, wasn't he was not called to account for this?
He was, but then he blamed someone else, and that still worked, even 10 years after.
Did he find a new villain, or was it the same old villain?
No, it was the same old villain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Trump can keep blaming the people he's blaming forever and get away with it, even if he doesn't improve the livelihood of these people.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is, don't do things that make it easy for him to blame you.
Yeah, that would be sort of a passive role. There's also an active.
Okay,
role.
so what should we do?
So Trump has a monopoly of meaning, in a sense. So he is the only one able now to tell these people something that allow them to think, to soothe their pain, right? And that is a narrative. Yeah, a narrative that, like the religious narrative, has no factual basis, but has some sort of mythological coherence to it, and that is good enough. Yeah, you have to be able to replace that narrative with another narrative. That does not mean it can be a true narrative, but it has to be a narrative all the same. It has to give meaning. It has to tell them, right, you're grieving because of this. This is what we're going to do, and this is what's going to follow. And I think I think this is where wealth inequality comes to place. I think that narrative existed, and that was the American dream. I think that one of the main pitfalls that all these post-factual opinion pieces fall into is to think that truth was always sort of the main currency of political debate, as if people made sense not only of the world but of their political life through solitary chains of facts. but they do so through narratives. Our own lives. I mean, I don't mean to be incredibly existentialist about it, but we all live through subjective lenses. I mean, I think that's something that many people can agree on.
We all have stories about ourselves that explain our failures and frame our hopes and so on.
And I mean, I don't want to go incredibly deep about it, but even facts and science are part of that story, which you just choose to believe because it has a better method or system behind it. But in any case, what I'm trying to say is that we make sense of life not through solitary chains of facts, but through this whole mechanism.
So it isn't that we're in a post-factual age or anything so much as the fact that all along human beings have been less governed by objective truth than you might think.
Yeah, because, I mean, and I must disclose this, but what informs my thinking is not only my own experience growing up in Venezuela, but also existentialist philosophy. I mean, there are things that I cannot simply tuck away. I mean, once I discuss politics, and I think Nietzsche, for example, makes a great point about truth not being the unconditional value of meaning, and I think that applies to politics as well as morality and so. So I mean, it's silly to think that just by being a master of the facts, you're going to be someone, happier or living a fuller life than someone who doesn't. And I think the whole premise of us always being content with living a factual world is absolutely bonkers.
And I think an example that may sound trivial coming after a reference to existential philosophy, but that I think is significant is that the anti-Trump forces are very eager, some of them, to find a big conspiracy involving Trump and the Russians. And it may be there, but I think I'm noticing people, opponents of Trump, being pretty uncritical in the way they embrace evidence they see supporting that narrative. They have a narrative, and
all the more to my point.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's always been narratives.
Right.
I mean, that's not only how people make sense of life in general, but in particular how they make sense of politics. There is a narrative. Obama is change. He's the first, African American president. He embodies, the triumph of, the civil liberty movements and so many other things. He's not factually someone who can make you better. And the fact that many people are incredibly outraged at the fact that this suddenly is the case is, I think, so silly. So once you realize that politics is a narrative world where, yes, to a large extent in the 20th century, especially the second half of it, you do have it more based on factual, discussions about policy and so on. It's true, but that does not mean that that's always been the case, and that is sort of the natural route to take.
So you mentioned that in addition to the passive solution, you might say, in other words, don't play the role of enemy. Don't make it easy to demonize you. Don't call them racist. Don't treat them with contempt. There are more active things that can be done. And you allude to some things that I think at least some politicians in Venezuela finally got around to doing. So what are the things, what are the active things that either regular people or politicians or whatever can do?
To make a powerful narrative. Ideally one based in facts, but rescuing the American, so it can take many different paths. It can be save America from the Russians. That can be a narrative that can work, for example, and I think it's working.
So in other words, if you can find a demon and convince these people that there's a demon they should be more worried about than the demon Trump wants them to worry about, that's one approach.
Yeah.
Well, or to put it another way, I mean, give them another explanation for their problems. But you know, in some ways, the some of the explanations have the disadvantage of being not that appealing. For example, I think many economists would say that although the role of low-wage immigration is not nothing, and the role of international trade is not nothing, in other words, in keeping American wages down, a big factor is just technology.
Yeah.
And an underrated factor is technology. But, you know, technology, and I suppose you might say there's some value in putting that into the narrative out and seeing if you can have some success there, if only to dilute the extent to which these others are blamed. At the same time, technology is not a very convenient demon because it's not a person, right?
Yeah, I mean, you need two things. You need a demon and a purpose. So, for example, the Hillary campaign, it absolutely lacked a purpose.
It had the demon was Trump.
Yeah, the demon was Trump,
but it had no positive narrative.
It had no second coming. It had no revolution. It had no true resolution.
Well, for the feminist part of her constituency, it kind of did. Her presidency was going to be the culmination of a long struggle. I think she overrated the power of that or the size of that constituency. But that was the part that was kind of salvational. Finally,
to some extent, that you're right. That could have been a narrative, but it wasn't, because another thing was that she had a very eclectic array of narratives working on at the same time. I think that is more to do with how many political consultants she had, but they all sort of had a different sort of approach to it. But the feminist narrative was there, and she played that card a few times, but that wasn't the narrative. Trump had a single narrative. And you need a single narrative. You need that. You definitely.
Well, what should her narrative have been?
I'm not sure if she was
let's put it another way. I mean, a question that's been asked.
I think it would have been to fight against wealth inequality. To some extent or another, but she would have been in a very awkward position to do so. But I think that is.
Bernie Sanders is an example of somebody who could have that narrative, who did, but didn't get the nomination.
I mean, and that is a curious. I mean, I'm not a Bernie supporter per se, because I disagree with many of his true political stances. I think he sincerely believes them. Even though I can see, well, that's a very. I mean, I can tell you all about what my political stance is, but let's not get into that now. But I think if he had gone into the general election, he might have done better than Hillary.
Let me ask you. So, there is in your Washington Post piece, you do talk about something that I gather was done with. I think you're saying was actually done by some people with some success, which was basically to convince the common people that actually you are one of them, or at least you have something in common with them. You say that some politicians did finally get around to going out there and playing dominoes with them or right? I mean, there was some of that outreach that you think, although it clearly wasn't completely effective because you basically have Chavez's heir ruling things down there, but there were, you saw examples of success, right?
Yeah. I mean, yes, there's so many things at play. One of them is this, tribal tendency, that is a result of the polarizing game that public is in place with you. And that can be broken by, having an outreach. But once you break the ice, you need to have something to say. And that's why, you really do need to find a narrative, and and that narrative cannot be Trump is a demon. Let's get rid of Trump, because that's just a terrible resolution. I mean, my point being is that the Hillary sort of resolution in this scheme of things would have been to leave things as they are, sort of thing. The economy is growing, unemployment is very low, so on and so forth. Let's just keep going. I mean, I think that's the message. So at the end, she was the candidate of the status quo. And there needs to be a break to some extent or another. There really needs to be a different resolution than just leaving things as usual.
Well, it sounds like two things. First of all, you need a leader who does a much better job than she did of not exacerbating the tribalism with remarks like basket of deplorables, but further doing some kind of outreach. And I kind of wonder whether politicians can just decide to do this. It's partly a matter of what kinds of people they are. Like Joe Biden, for example, just seems more like a common person and has lived that role in politics more. So it's like, A, don't make things worse. B, be someone that these people can identify with. And then C, have a narrative that addresses the grievances that Trump's narrative addresses.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And that brings me to another point that's very interesting, is that there is a great degree of cynicism by in the parts of these populist leaders, say Trump and Chavez. But there's also a certain profile. I think another similarity between Trump and Chavez is that they are not megalomaniacs in the sort of strict sense of the world. The word, they don't want to be like Napoleon. I don't think so much. They want to conquer the world. I mean, many people. That's not being said of Trump yet, but I think it will at some point, because it was said of Chavez. Oh, he just wants to rule everything. He's power hungry and so on and so forth. But I think the main description is not megalomaniac, but mythomaniac. Someone who believes their own lies. Someone who believes their own myths. And that's a profile very different to, say, Joe Biden's. Even though I absolutely agree with you, he's more of a common man kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an integral component to it. You need a prophet for this to work. I mean, this is a phenomenon.
You need a prophet. You need someone with a somewhat messianic message.
Yeah, someone willing to kill their own children at the mouth. Yeah.
You mean someone with a message of salvation, or
no? Someone convinced in it themselves. I think Hitler also fits this mold.
So you're saying that the alternative to Trump needs to be someone who is in some sense extreme, or am I totally misunderstanding?
No.
You're saying this is the profile that Trump.
I'm saying you're playing a very different ball game against Trump. Please don't bring another prophet into the game. But you need to be aware that you're fighting a different game, and you need to play with different rules. But hopefully, it will be someone more like commonsensical or more of a common man, like Biden. But it's again, it's a phenomenon. It's a curious thing. It's like the great man history theory as well of history. It's like, how is it possible for these people? Because who would fit in Donald Trump's shoes? If Donald Trump had not been alive, or hadn't been born.
Yeah, I mean, I think there might well have been somebody, and it might have been somebody in some ways more capable than him, but it's hard to imagine the person that it might have been. It's he's so strange in so many ways.
Yeah.
That it certainly, if he weren't around, it wouldn't be somebody very much like him, even if the message were similar. But
then again, but that's the point. It's a big part of the messenger is integral to the message. You need someone to be absolutely convinced of what there is. I mean, it's just a similarity. I don't want to be dogmatic about it either, but there's another similarity that strikes me. When I see Trump tweeting,
complete confidence in their mission.
Yeah, and this sort of like psychotic, conviction as well. I mean, when I see Donald Trump tweeting at 6 a.m. about Obama wiretapping. I think he's actually convinced about it. It's funny, but he's the president of the United States, but he reads Breitbart all the same. and I think that's that's integral to it, and that's why it's also very scary, because many people think, oh, Trump got into power to leave things as usual, to sort of bring about the traditional Republican platform of the healthcare bill which was seen, or lowering taxes and so on and so forth, and he was just being a hypocrite and using all these things and then getting into power and letting all those things happen. I think he's actually convinced on creating this world. So as was Chavez. I think at some point or another, especially the later stages of his presidency and the last years of his life, I think he was less bent on whatever. People blamed him of stealing money, which he did, and many people around him did. It was an incredibly big corruption industry, but I think he was less focused on actually getting the money or actually staying in power over his life, but more bent on realizing this mythology that he had in his head.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so we will. I'll take your points. Try to not make the polarization worse. Ideally, convince Trump supporters that their demons actually have more in common for them and more sympathy for them than they think, and also ideally come up with a narrative. Although I'm not yet sure what that is. But thanks for comparing the two situations. This has been very enlightening. Now, where is there somewhere people should go to find your stuff? I mean, is there a Twitter handle or?
Yeah. There's a Twitter handle, AMERONDON, Rondon, which is Andrés Miguel Rondon, but shortened. And that should be enough. I think that should be good.
And you may have more pieces coming out, maybe in Politico or elsewhere, that address this topic from a different angle.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Andrés.
Thank you, Robert.
Take care.